Hi, my name is Mark Penrith and I pastor at Benoni Baptist Church. What I wanted to talk about was the relationship between the church and the state, the relationship between the church and the state. Right now in South Africa, the CRL Commission, which is a Chapter 9 organization, Chapter 9 constitutional organization, institution, is in the process of putting in place a peer review mechanism, which ultimately will enable the state to license pastors in South Africa. I'm a Baptist, and so we have a long history of this engagement and relationship between the church and the state, going all the way back to 1660. In 1660, the state, then England, was wanting to license Baptist pastors. One of those pastors was a man named John Bunyan. John Bunyan refused to be licensed by the state, and as a result spent 12 years in prison, first close to his hometown and then later in the notorious prison London Tower, because of his refusal to have the state licensed to sit over the preaching of God's word. As I've been reflecting on that, I've been looking at Romans chapter 13. In Romans chapter 13, we first hear of this relationship between a believer and the state, and we're told that we're to submit to the state. It says, everyone submit to the government authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. Paul starts off by saying that really, as we look at the power of the throne, the power of the king, the power of the president, we must recognize that their power exists only because there is a greater power, and that is that of God, that He sits as the ultimate authority over every sphere of authority in human life. But then he goes on and he describes what is the duty of the state in this world. We read the following in verse 3, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Well, do what is good and you will have its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For it is God's servant, an avenger, that brings wrath on the one who does wrong." What God's word reveals is that the state has two primary responsibilities. First, its responsibility is to reward good conduct in society, to make sure that the administration of society is free and proper and fair. And then its second responsibility is to ensure that those who transgress the normal civil codes and laws of the country are held to account. In this way, it acts as God's minister, really God's diakonos, God's deacon, God's minister, God's ruler in this way, that it takes care of that. Now, when the authority, when the ruler, when the state steps outside of its God-given mandate, when it tries to operate in the sphere of the church, it has transgressed God's intended design for the state. It's not so much that the state doesn't have authority, it's that God has mandated its authority to be over its citizens. Just like God has mandated that parents have authority over their own children and elders have authority in the church, so too the state has mandated authority over its citizens. But when it tries to wrest the keys of the kingdom away from the church, we sit with major problems because it is trying to do something that God has not ordained it to do. As we get closer and closer to the CRL intending to license preachers even in our country, in South Africa, we must be encouraged as believers to, yes, submit to the state authorities, but where the state asks us to do something which is contrary to God's word, we need to recognize that we must obey God and not man. We see that in the testimony of the disciples in the book of Acts in chapter 5, where they are told to stop preaching. Friends, when the state requires us to do something which God mandates us to do, even as we submit to the discipline that bring, we must recognize that we can't obey illegitimate laws that they might hold us to. the church has a relationship to the state, and the state has a relationship to the church in that we both relate to God and His mandate over us. I do trust in this rolling dialogue between the church and the state in South Africa that the church has the ability to stand up and be heard and ultimately speak for God's justice, God's way, and God's will. That we might see the various different spheres that God has mandated, whether it be family, whether it be church, or whether it be state, each one of the authorities in those spheres operating in God's intended way, that He might be glorified and that it might be for our good.